few minutes to fill out all of our ballots, and then we'll get ready to start. All right, so while the other judges maybe fill out the last of their ballots, then I'll just do some housekeeping. So first of all, I'll share the screen to make sure that we have a stopwatch. So if everyone could confirm that they can see this. Yeah, excellent. Oh, I'll just go into the stopwatch as well. Cool. All right, and because online is quite disturbing, I won't do any sort of clapping or any other indications, so please refer to the stopwatch for protected time. Please make sure to keep speaking orders. I would also encourage all speakers to indicate how they prefer to take PYs before their speech begins. And then now I think we're ready to do the last practical thing, which is to introduce ourselves. My name is Jonas. I'm an IA for this tournament, but I am from Denmark, and I'll be the chair for this round. With me on my panel, I have...
Hi, Mark. Mark, I'm also...
Very effective introductions, doing it at the same time. All right, so if there aren't any further questions before we begin, I'll take that as a clean no. Then, without further ado, I'd like to welcome the first proposition speaker to open the debate. Hear, hear.
Am I audible? Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
The need for independent academic research cannot be overstated. It is within these labs that we have scientific breakthroughs that help us understand our world and navigate both the dangers and benefits of all the products we use. On side proposition, we refuse to sell our academic integrity to the highest bidder, and for those reasons, I'm incredibly proud to propose. There will be three constructive arguments coming up from this proposition bench. First, on why you strip corporate accountability. Second, on why you harm university research priorities. And finally, why the benefits of research are accrued to the wrong actors. Before that, I want to get into a model for this debate and general clarification of what it will look like. So we're talking about often corporate funding of specific research studies. Typically includes within STEM fields where they often want verification of specific results of their products. On our side of the house, we propose the alternative of having government funding and think it is very likely that it will fill in place of corporate funding, given there's extreme value to all of these fields and to this research happening to these institutions for national competition research. Why is it we think on their side of the house, there's reasons for universities to accept this funding, even though it may not be beneficial? So first of all, individual professors or departments themselves are the ones choosing often to take on these corporate-sponsored research. Second of all, and most importantly, it's a problem of a first mover problem. As soon as one university accepts this funding, every other university usually follows suit because it's such a competitive landscape of universities. They're competing for research rankings and for prestige that smaller institutions follow the more prestigious ones as they get more funding from corporations, and we cannot accept that on our side of the house. So with that being said, on to the first constructive argument then, about why you strip corporate accountability. And here the thesis of this argument is that corporate-sponsored research is fit for the corporate agenda and is actively harmful for public information. And I want to characterize, first of all, why there's a reason for this research to be done in this particular way. All this funding that is done for this research is for trying to obtain a specific result that benefits the company, whether it is maximizing the benefits of the product from that company, whether it's minimizing dangers associated, or trying to prove the functionality of their products. That's the reason why they're funding and putting so much money into these institutions in the first place. They expect returns of validation that would allow for advertising benefits or to pass regulatory standards, because in-house research is seen as less credible by the fact that obviously they're going to be swayed in a way that benefits the corporation's agenda. So they're capitalizing on the supposed neutrality and independence and perceived independence of these institutions for the benefit. And there's a good reason why all the scientists and professors that accept all this funding have to follow that corporate agenda, because at any other point, the corporation can threaten to pull the funding for them. So it means that they're contained on a very tight leash to fit their agenda. But second of all, why do they actually have the ability to fit that corporate agenda within their research? We think that science can be used in a lot of different ways to fit the result if you have a specific goal in mind and are not researching for the sake of pure independent thought and process. So first of all, the way you set up the study, whether it's your sample size, the diversity of that sample size, the variables you choose, the scope, the subjects you choose, and the data sets that you choose can all be selectively done in a way to fit whatever result that the corporation wants. Second of all, how you actually interpret the results. Even the same exact study with the same data can get many different conclusions drawn from it, whether it's what data you chose to focus on, what you choose to include or not include. And know what is most problematic and pernicious about this is that there's no way to regulate any of these problems. It is not about patently false or a completely fake information and news. It is the subtler, grayer areas where it is misleading information, what kinds of data you look at, and what incentives you have as a professor being funded by a corporation for that research. There are multiple harms from this. It looks like research being funded by the company Johnson to minimize the dangers of talc within baby products and the potential risk of cancer that leads from their products, misleading generations and millions of women, mothers, and children who are using these products and continually develop health problems as a result. It misleads the public because they do not have the technical expertise to actually understand the research process. They neither do not have the time either to look at how that research was done, whether the variables were done right, whether that sample size was representative. And the issue is that all they see is the result. Because on the consumer side, what they see is the advertising, the way media picks up information, and the result is overwhelmingly what they focus on. So that is, first of all, little consumer awareness and misleading of the consumer base. But second of all, it also makes it more difficult to actually preemptively prevent all of these problems through regulation, for example, because the credibility of these institutions create a false sense of safety, not only for consumers, but also for regulators looking at all these products and their institutions. So you cannot preemptively prevent a lot of these problems. But finally, even after all these problems accrue with problematic products let out with the perception of safety, they often can also prevent justice from being served, whether it's through lawsuits with professors in their pocket in their area of expertise providing testimony that prevents actual justice from being served from victims. So look at the fact that when victims were trying to sue tobacco companies in court for the host of health problems that they developed from their products, they were able to selectively pick out the professors that they had already funded for research that benefited their agenda, that on face seemed to be reasonable as it was done with an independent institution with very credible researchers, but in a way that only drives home the agenda of these corporations. We cannot stand for that on-side proposition because that completely undermines the purpose of neutral scientific research that is supposed to aid the public in determining what products are safe and how to use them. So on their side, they absolutely have no accountability for corporations. The second argument is about why it actually harm universities' research priorities. Before I move on to this argument, I'll take a POI.
Why would an academic knowingly carry out fake research when the discovery of this would end their career and professional reputation?
First of all, I think that POI completely missed the nuance within our argument, which is that they are not actively creating fake goal in mind. And the issue here is that even if they would like to personally object, if your side of the house has a lot of funding dependent on corporations, it is very difficult to actually contest against that. And we think having that situation means that it is a very difficult choice for professors and academics who unfortunately have to fit that fold on your side of the house. But the second argument now is about why you actually harm university research priorities. And here I want to characterize why there's a direct opportunity cost of all the funding that comes from corporations, and the kinds of research you get is actually not productive or valuable. So first of all, Most of this research is actually focused around validating or verifying the effects of existing products rather than active creation or discovery of new things within new fields. The reason for why this is the case is because production and all the processes that go into that in terms of research are mostly done in-house within the corporation themselves with their own scientists and researchers, given that that information is proprietary and they would never release it to those institutions in the first place. And the purpose of the institution is just to verify what they already have. This is an opportunity cost at more productive and valuable research, like discovery, for two main reasons. First of all, the time that you allocate to all of this research for companies, for the large grants that you get from these companies, means that you don't have as much time to focus on other research that we think is productive and valuable for individuals. Second of all, institutional capacities of these universities and research organizations adapt to orient around this specific kind of research. So it looks like the way grad students are trained is for the specific mode of study to verifying the effects. The kinds of equipment, labs, and technology that you develop shifts in a way to support the kinds of funding and priority of research that you have, which is about verification rather than discovery. This is extremely harmful because independent academic and educational institutions are the best and sole place where we can have this kind of ingenuity and discovery. This is where the minds and space exist to have innovation, for example, and discoveries that benefit all of the public. Why on our side of the house will that actually increase when we have less of that corporate funding and more government funding? First of all, because of the fact that you actively want to compete for that government funding to prove that you'll be using it for good means, and actively want your research rankings as an institution to rise through citations from valuable discoveries. Second, you have more freedom to explore when you're not constrained to a specific area of that field decided by the corporation that is funding all of your research. That means we can get more discoveries like we had in the past with nanomaterials that have biological innovation, aerospace innovation within fields that lead to computing benefits for all of society. Because we get better research and also accountable research, I'm incredibly proud.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome the first opposition speaker to open the day from their side of the house. Here.
Hi, can everyone hear me? As a team, mark references for POIs visually, if that is possible. The very reason that corporations prize the research of academic institutions is because they are independent. The reason they are perceived as independent institutions is because they are independent. That is the very reason it is beneficial to get this research. Because what side proposition showed is that they don't know how academic research works. They didn't know about the peer review process. They didn't know about how important reputation is. They didn't know about the fact that your study is tested based on whether it could be replicated from a number of different places. They showed that they didn't understand the specific role of academic research within society, and for that reason, they cannot win this debate. 3 arguments for you from opposition. Firstly, what research disappears on their side? Secondly, why is this research so critical? Thirdly, our second speech will look at the drain of researchers from academic institutions. Before that, our stance on opposition. Firstly, we support a wide range of sponsors of research: academic institutions, the government, philanthropists, and yes, corporations. Secondly, we support laws which exist in the status quo, where if your research is sponsored, that must be declared publicly, openly, and very visibly. Thirdly, we also support the existing system of rigorous academic checks, peer review boards, which exist in the status quo and which side proposition decided to ignore. But we are willing to concede there is an existing pool of bad research which exists. It probably exists on either side. We accept it exists, and more of that research might happen on our side. But what they have to show is why that outweighs the number of positive research which is exclusive to our side. Before I go into my arguments, a couple of areas of rebuttal. Firstly, on their model of government funding research, 4 responses to this. Firstly, they clearly don't understand how much money corporations are putting into research. It is literally billions. If they think the government is going to prioritize that, they are wrong. Secondly, the government has a fixed budget. Imagine being the government that prioritized paying academics to research AI while there are hospitals with not enough doctors in them. No government would be the government to do that. Thirdly, research is often long-term. It often slips out of election cycles, and it's often risky. The riskiest research with the largest rewards cannot be taken in by governments because they don't want to risk millions of dollars. But fourthly here, we can have this under our side as well. If there is such a government impetus to have this research, we get this on our side, plus corporations' research as well. That is not exclusive to their side. On this idea of perceived independence, firstly, if they are not independent, we think it is very clear from the fact you have declared that you have sponsored that research that it is not necessarily independent. Secondly, there is a tension within their case when they claim that the reason that they research is so prized is because it is seen as independent, but also that they will be able to keep academics on tight leashes. We think one of those things is true, because if one academic speaks out and says, I was kept on a tight leash, then your credibility, the perception of independence is gone, and any benefit you get from that research is gone. And on this idea of like it being used by judges, we think, put simply, when you look into this research, if you see it as false, you will call it out to be false. On this new areas of research stuff, firstly, we would note if you have more grants, you can pay more professors. It's just the number of resources and the amount of people. We don't think that changes significantly on your side. But what research disappears under their side, but before that, yes.
How can any of these professors speak up in any meaningful way if your side claims that they are dependent on all this funding from corporations to keep going?
We don't think they are necessarily completely dependent on this funding. But what we tell you is that you analyse corporations' interests as independent research being useful to them. We think they want that to remain independent. We think it is likely that at least one academic has spoken up about this and has spoken up about this in the past. So, what research do companies and not governments have an incentive to fund? Firstly, discovery work which is speculative. The huge financial resources of corporations mean they can take huge gambles that the government can't. This looks like Google working with Stanford to develop driverless cars. We don't think that is something that the government can do. Secondly, big research which requires wide circles of data and large amounts of data. This looks like drug trials where you need wide sample sizes to show the efficacy of that study. We think those studies need significant amounts of money that corporations can provide. Thirdly, we would note that there is an increasing trend of corporations wanting to appear to do social good. We think Facebook have funded research on racial bias in facial recognition technology. We think there is an increasing trend of corporations funding research into problems within their own areas. And fourthly, the safety of their own products. They literally talked about this. We don't think corporations want to kill people. Johnson & Johnson's have been completely disgraced by that. The professors who attested to that have had their reputations destroyed. No thank you. I think the researchers are often good-natured, good people who want to do the right thing. We don't think they want their research to kill people. But what are the checks on all of these incentives? 4 things. Firstly, there is peer review by experts. Every academic paper you try to publish is peer-reviewed by a panel of experts. Secondly, no thank you, there are competing studies. If your study is terrible, you as a separate research to build up your reputation have an incentive to call out that study. Thirdly, know how embarrassing it is to be rejected by peer review. We think there is a self-censoring process to never bring terrible research to that peer review. No thank you. And notably, the people on that peer review have an interest in savaging your study to try and increase their reputation. If you give them grounds to attack you, they are going to attack you. But fourthly and crucially, there is replication. If researchers from Zhejiang University in Beijing can't replicate a sponsored study from Tsinghua University, it won't get through peer review. Replication means your research has to have some factual basis. In that context, why does positive research outweigh negative research? Why do you think the negative research is limited? And this comes in direct response to their material. Firstly, I think there is a massive incentive for people to push against corporate inaccurate research. We think researchers are intelligent people who could be earning a lot more. If you are a physics researcher at the University of Tel Aviv, you could be earning much more money. We think you care about your reputation, you care about pushing back to not be involved in bad research. Even a corporation isn't going to hire someone who's been disgraced for producing terrible, inaccurate research. But thirdly, we don't think most people see an academic paper about the effects of fast food and then choose that that is the reason they're going to go and have a McDonald's. We don't see the direct effect on people that academic research specifically has. They need to make it clear why it is such a huge impact. But why is this research so important? Firstly, this positive research has a huge effect. Discovering a new drug, discovering a more effective version of insulin. These are huge in impacting people's quality of life. Secondly, these things wouldn't have happened otherwise. We showed you structurally why corporations have unique incentives independent of governments to produce this research. And the comparative is that this research never happens. Thirdly, the riskiest research, as I've said, yields the greatest rewards. If it requires huge money, you get a high amount of yield from it. The burden of proposition is to show why so much bad, so much unchallenged research outweighs the sheer amount of positive research we get on our side. That looks like immunotherapy, which could be effective in 30% of cases. More research is the best possible world for any side in this debate. We think that side is side opposition.
Hi, sorry. I have a question. We need to trainee Arya move to the room A25. So I think that doesn't affect this debate because he's a trainee, but just to say that.
Okay, cool. Yeah, go ahead. All right. Yes. Well, that aside, I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that speech and welcome the second proposition speaker to continue the case on their side of the house. Here.
There are two inherent tensions in the case the opposition just gave to you. The first is that this is unique niche research that no other researchers will do if not for corporate research. And then their main mechanism as to why there's any measure of accountability on this research is that there is widespread peer review. Opposition cannot have it both ways. Either companies are innovating brand new fields where there are very few academics and not much mainstream information, which results in new innovation, or there's a significant amount of peer review because there's tons of established literature and lots of experts. It can't be both, and for their frame to work, the peer review framework cannot be effective. But the second thing to note is that it's very easy for companies to get around peer review, which is why Angela had all those examples in her speech, because it's as simple as paying off multiple universities with corporate sponsorship so that the peer reviewers all have the same incentives. You can fund studies from multiple different universities. Opposition is correct that billions of dollars go into this. The billions of dollars are what allow thousands of these studies to get into courtrooms out of universities and bypass peer review. Just saying that the system exists and then giving analysis that contradicts that system's actual effectiveness is not enough for opposition to rebut the vast majority of the argument that we give. The second tension that they have is the characterization that universities are incredibly dependent on this funding. And as such, with the loss of this funding, their third argument implies professors will leave, universities will fall apart to a significant degree, and governments can't fill the gap. This concedes dependency, as Angela illustrates, because our case was never that false information is created. Prof is right. There are reputational incentives that mean that very few researchers will give abruptly false information. But the problem is these are massive longitudinal studies over massive amounts of data, such as the effects of cigarettes, talc powder, etc. When we're talking about data sets that large, as Angela identified, there are so many different points that can be omitted from data, so many different ways you can graph it, so many different conclusions that can be drawn, that it no longer becomes a matter of falsification, but rather an amount of inherent subjectivity that exists in this research. We say that when dependency exists, you always err to the side of companies when your research and the valuable information that opposition said would exist gets cut off. First question on companies. Their basic analysis here is that a lot of this research ends up being effective. For instance, you get drugs like insulin or you get Google driverless cars. I'll note that both of their examples were implicitly refuted by Angela already. In the case of insulin, she already proved that this will not be the type of research that universities will commission, because there is very little incentive to want your in-house drug to be created by a university, which can then take credit for it and where you have no control over the process. That is why big drug companies like AstraZeneca have their own billion-dollar research departments that do their own research in the status quo. What university verification is about is not the production of new materials, but rather about verification. And even their best example of Google and Stanford also fit into this framework, because Google already created self-driving cars. They brought in Stanford in order to verify the results, which they could have viably done in-house, maybe in this world. But also, obviously, there's an incentive now for Stanford, which is reliant on billions of dollars of Google funding for their own self-driving car projects to go along with them, which is why many of those Google cars incidentally crashed into pedestrians, despite studies saying that they would not. So I think that example is actually an example for our side of the house. The second thing that they say on companies is that they're likely to have good incentives because in the case of Johnson & Johnson, for instance, their reputation was ruined. I'll note that their reputation was ruined after thousands of women had their uteruses destroyed by talc powder. That incentive only kicks in later. The damage is already done. But the second thing to observe is that the studies in the case of Johnson & Johnson weren't even falsified studies. They just omitted certain data points that were based on accurate academic info. Their example is wrong. A significant amount of the professors involved in that kept their jobs, and the reason they were fired is broadly reputational. So actually, this again is an example for our side of subtle data manipulation that allowed thousands of individuals to suffer from the manipulation of companies. What is the implication at the end of this? Their side enables companies to get legitimacy. And the only response they have to this is, well, if there's one whistleblower, there goes your legitimacy. One whistleblower when Harvard does a study is not enough to get rid of the legitimacy of their studies. They can still be used in courtrooms, and even their mechanism of having multiple studies doesn't work, because at best, you get multiple studies that then judges weigh up who are not experts in any substantial way. That is why you have the problems of expert witnesses being incredibly unreliable in trials. The final thing I want to address is funding, because this is the broad trade-off that we have to accept in the round. They give a couple of reasons as to why governments will not fully fill the gap, and we agree, governments will not fully fund the gap. The purpose of our analysis here is mitigatory. The difference in funding will not be billions upon billions of dollars because there are significant national competition incentives for governments to fund. Their response is these incentives exist on our side, on their side as well, so you get the benefit of both corporate funding and of government funding. That is true, but a reason why governments are freed of the burden of having to fund right now is that corporate research funding exists. When it no longer exists, governments are forced to change their calculus. Also note that there are general economic and political incentives to fund research, given that it generally results in national productivity, more researchers coming, immigration, a larger tax base, etc. There are structural reasons why governments fund universities so much. Before I go on, POI.
If reputational reasons was the reason Johnson & Johnson's professors were removed, why isn't reputation a check on falsified research, which includes omitting data points?
It's not active omission. It's about the shifting in research priorities. Opposition continues to strawman this argument. Obviously, on both sides, there will be accurate studies are done. The argument that we are making is that the research priorities of professors are shifted, not in a way that they decide to falsify the data, but they look at different questions. They run different experiments with different groups because in the back of their mind, they want a particular outcome that gets them more corporate funding in the long run. We don't need to have data falsification. We don't need to have outright academic fraud. We just need to have a massive shift in the way that universities allocate resources that go into non-productive verification of corporate, making sure that companies' own products are safe rather than active research. On the second question of universities, their big idea that they decided to backload into their second speech is that people are likely to leave, university professors go out of academia, the funding argument and mitigation that we give mitigate this somewhat. So where's the analysis that comes in from our side? We explain what a time allocation is uniquely important. The time that can go on to actually useful research is likely to be much more effective for universities. Third argument then, I'll note this claim takes opposition in their best case. Even if we believe that valuable research comes out of their side, and even if we believe there's no manipulation of data whatsoever and no shifting of priorities, this is why we still win. Because in almost all cases where companies make deals with universities, they want to insure themselves against circumstances under which universities are able to disproportionately benefit. Two examples of this occurring. Companies almost always write into sponsorship contracts that they have exclusive rights over the intellectual property that results from these arrangements. So for instance, in the case of Google Stanford, Google has extreme intellectual property rights to any and all studies that are created by Stanford University. Similarly, Nokia managed to get the microchips that powered their phones by functionally stealing it from a university with whom they had sponsored research and then used a legal clause in the contract to get that patent. Driscoll Berries, the largest agricultural company in the United States, also has the patent to almost all fruit in the United States because they stole the patents in the 1980s from UC Santa Barbara by creating exactly one of these arrangements. Structurally, universities are reliant on this funding, as opposition identifies, and that is why, given the first mover advantage and the other analysis that we give, universities are forced into taking contracts that give up almost all intellectual property rights to the company at the end. There are two implications at the end of this. One, universities cannot profit from any of this research, so even though they get more funding in for it, they can't profit. This keeps universities reliant on companies into the long run because they're not getting any wealthier from this research like they would for other research. The second thing is the patents always go to companies, not to universities. They often sit on them in the case of Driscoll-Berry's patents to prevent other people from getting them. So while there might be benefits of innovation on their side, they go to companies that sit on them or keep them for profit rather than to universities. They abuse the academy, and we refuse to sell our academic integrity to the highest bidder. That is why we propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that speech, and I would like to welcome the second opposition speaker. Here. England, you're muted again.
Oh, sorry. Alright. Can everyone hear me now? Panel, it is quite clear that Team Canada know nothing about two things. They know nothing about what universities look like. Because when they literally lie to you and say that Google owns all the intellectual property rights of Stanford, panel, that is simply untrue, and we believe it is incredibly implausible. Because universities are large institutions. Universities which companies want to work with have huge reputations that literally go back centuries in many cases. They often do different research with lots of different corporations. So we don't think it's the case that one company can simply buy out an entire university. We do think it's the case that one company can fund one piece of research where maybe another company funds an opposing piece of research because they want to prove that that other company's product is not good. There are different actors that play in this, different actors who all have incentives to falsify each other, which means more information comes out. In a world with more research, we think it is fundamentally implausible. We give you structural reasons as to why that is the case in Joe's speech as to why things are more misleading. They also mischaracterize the idea of peer review because they want to assert that you can buy out peer reviewers, they can buy out all these different things. But yes, actually, that Johnson & Johnson case was proved false. We do think peer review can happen because lots of different academic professors, lots of different companies have incentives to look at the data and say, look, they used a ridiculous sample size because this is how they gain their reputations, this is how they falsify their competitors' products, and this is perfectly possible when the research comes to light. Panel, we think that this complete mischaracterization of what Harvard and Stanford and Oxford and Cambridge and Qingdao and Peking University looks like, and claiming they are beholden to single companies is absolutely ridiculous. In this speech, I'm going to deal with some rebuttal to the points we have heard from the other side, going to deal with the limited responses we heard to Joe's material, and then I'm going to tell you why big corporations take researchers away from academic institutions. Firstly, just clearing up the two tensions they claim to exist in our case, but simply aren't tensions. What does Max tell you? He tells you firstly that there is a tension between us saying these companies provide unique research and there's the accountability of peer review. We think peer review can happen in multiple different ways, one of which is simply looking at the research and saying, panel, this is ridiculously biased. These sample sizes are clearly wrong. These things are clearly ridiculous. That only happens when the research actually comes out. And we think actually you get more ability for people to research in ways that counteract commercial interests when you have two things. Firstly, when you have other companies competing against each other, and secondly, when governments have more money to fund that research because they're not having to fund the other research as well. The second thing they tell you is that we can't simultaneously claim that universities are depending on funding and they're independent. We think we can, because they're dependent on the pool of funding that comes from a variety of different corporations, but that means when they come as a body, they are independent. This was a mischaracterization of how this funding comes, and we think the fact that they themselves tell you that companies want to work with institutions perceived as independent, want to have more citations, they concede this as well. Okay, what do we hear from the other side? We hear three things. Firstly, we get told that corporations fund misleading research in two ways. The first, we have selective sample sizes and processes. Look, I've already told you that there's going to be huge scrutiny towards these sample sizes because every single journalist and every single other talc powder company has an incentive to pull out Johnson & Johnson's research. We don't think there's a single company operating in this, and when this research is made public because it's done through an academic institution, that's when you can point the holes, that's when you can pull it out. And we still think that the academics they're working with generally have incentives to maintain their reputation. We think that people who worked for Johnson & Johnson had their reputations destroyed, or a show trial that scared all other professors. The second thing is they tell you is that misleading conclusions can be drawn from poor research. Look, if you can draw multiple different conclusions from one piece of research, that's exactly why you should vote for our side panel. Because it means when this research is put out there, it's not like Johnson & Johnson's can be like, I'm the only one who's allowed to read my academic paper, because then it wouldn't be an academic paper that they were gaining any value from. Multiple people can read this paper, and maybe it's not the consumer walking down the lines of a supermarket, but we still think professors exist. That's why peer review works. Second thing they tell you that it forces academic institutions to focus poorly on verification. Two responses. Firstly, we think it's really unclear, panel, where verification happens on their side, because there's one of two options. Either verification of products on their side is done fully in-house, in which case we think it's much more likely to be dodgy, where researchers are much more beholden to the companies, or it literally doesn't happen in the first place, and you have fewer investigations into what the effects of these products are. Second response, we think it's a complete mischaracterization when they claim you're taking up limited research capacity or time. We think that we know that corporations invest billions of dollars into universities. This isn't about things being limited. We think you simply increase the capacity. But then they tell you, but we get more positive research when people compete for government funding, when the government's free of the funding imperative. Three responses. Firstly, we think the fact that government's free of funding imperative concedes that some of this research is good. Secondly, this was unresponsive to the several reasons Joe gave you as to why governments don't want to fund the dodgy professors who no one really cares about for a project that will yield results in 30 years. And thirdly, we think the idea of universities competing is non-comparative with government funding. They still want government funding on our house. Thirdly, we get told that extreme intellectual property rights are a bad thing. Two responses. We think this is really inconsistent with their case because they said that universities had no incentive to innovate because they had to give up their property rights. We think they can maintain property rights. We're not unclear why that's so bad when on their side they're still doing this research, just it's even more secret when it's in-house. Secondly, we think this was kind of like contradictory when they said there is no way these studies can be falsified and they also had to buy up all the research. This was really unclear. What did Joe tell you? Joe told you why companies have incentives to give research, things like discoveries and big studies. And all we were told is that discoveries research is all done in-house because they don't want to share material. Look, panel, often you don't know if you're going to get something out of a study. It's not like you're saying specifically, I'm going to build this one product. It's rather you see someone working in some university on some chip that might one day build into a project. We think that academic research is often an area of discovery. And yes, while companies are actually constructing the product, they might take it in-house. We think funding loads of different areas and then taking the research from there is exactly how they do this, because they don't have the capacity to have literally tons of labs rolling down every single avenue. They give you no other reasons to why what Joe tells you about structural incentives to have good research weren't true. We think this was bizarre. Why do we think big corporations take researchers away from academic institutions? Look, on their side, corporations still fund research. They don't do it in the same is this thing, such as verification, has to happen in-house. When academic researchers can't get posts at university because the volume of funding is fundamentally much lower, they're forced to go work from Johnson & Johnson, where they lose out on other opportunities for research when they're much more beholden to their companies. Panel, they don't deal with the fact that they have a huge gap in funding. Asserting it's not that big doesn't deal with everything Joe told you. In a world with more information, you have more true information. I urge you to oppose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome the third proposition speaker. Here.
Sorry, just a moment. Origins. Sorry about that. Two brief observations at the top of the speech. Firstly, on their 25-second third argument that this is going to suck away researchers from universities. One, this is entirely hung on the marginal decrease in funding being excessive. They've added nothing in their second speech other than an argument that is entirely reliant on everything that came out in their first speech. Second, I'd point out that a lot of researchers at universities also just want to be professors, so there are competing incentives and reasons why they stay at those institutions anyway. 25-second argument won't cut it. Second observation at the top. I want to bring back our frame on why the majority of this research is verification and not innovation. We told you that because alternatively, because the majority of innovation happens in-house because companies want to preserve their proprietary research. They say if it's in-house, it's even more dodgy. That's perhaps true, but our argument is that that part of the debate is symmetric. Our second part was that even if it is not in-house, and even if you do have proprietary research, in universities, this is our third argument, it wasn't a contradiction because we clearly said it operated in the best case of side proposition, then those companies end up sitting on the patents. What that meant is universities don't get any of the money for alternative sources of research. Companies get the patents, that suffocates innovation. It allows them to charge high prices that precludes access to any of the benefits that proposition wanted. Their only response is an assertion that this is untrue. And the reasoning seems to be universities have leverage because they can turn to other companies. My response is that universities do not have the leverage here for three reasons. Number one, because the university's research needs a niche to be filled. That means they're beholden to a company. The company just needs a couple of professors and a lab that they can get anywhere, which is why there's an asymmetry here where the company dictates what's done and not the university. Second, because if you buy any of their mechanisms on funding being so greatly dependent on companies, that is also a reason why companies have massive leverage because they can withdraw that funding at any given moment. And that is why companies are likely to condition their funding on the ability to keep those intellectual property rights and not just give them away to university that can steal them. So that is why, on balance, companies are more likely to have leverage in these scenarios. And that is why also these are likely to be research that fills the purpose of companies and not what universities otherwise would have done. I'm going to talk about three things. One, what is the value of this research? Second, why is the change in funding marginal? And third, how do they shift the priorities of universities in a bad way? Firstly, what is the value of these studies? I want to point out, if we've proven our claim on manipulation and bad outcomes, cancer research that ends up being detrimental, tobacco testifications that end up being bad as well, we've won the round. And the reason is simple. Their increase in funding doesn't matter if we've proven that that funding only does active harm to consumers and people within society. So if we prove this argument, we win the round. Now, what did we tell you? We told you that companies have leverage and end up spreading misinformation that is actively harmful. They get professors in their pockets to testify for tobacco companies. They spread misleading information about their products and that they don't lead to cancer. We get three competing accountability mechanisms coming from the opposition team. The first is that people are going to speak out. The first thing we told you, though, is that because there's no outright falsification, it is very, very difficult to identify that falsification in advance. It looks like omitted data points and not outright false statements. So if their mechanism is that everyday people are going to speak out, that is not sufficient, especially because those people don't have enough knowledge to destroy Harvard's credibility. And furthermore, because all other talc powder companies, for example, want talc to be perceived as safe, which is why you get collusion and you don't get companies calling each other out, but you get them colluding to get the same outcome of the study from that university. So there's no cross-comparison point at which you ensure accountability. Their second reason is that professors are held accountable because they want to avoid the reputational damage.
The first thing we told you is that oftentimes these professors are kept in the dark. They have a broad study that the company chooses, and then the company chooses which conclusion to publish. Furthermore, the professor wants to be in the pocket of the company and won't speak out because it wants to get research grants in the future, for example, that fill its niche. Look, professors aren't the most ethical people necessarily. They are interested in research and want to preserve their capacity to do so. It is unlikely they speak out against the company. Second, though, there is no broad reputational damage to the individual professor. People see, no thank you, Harvard's stamp on a study. They do not see the specific name of the professor at Harvard who is necessarily involved in the study. And that is why they weren't fired in the case of Johnson & Johnson. So if their mechanism was professors will speak out, that missed the point of how they do not fear that reputational damage. The final thing they say is we have competing studies and peer review that holds these studies to account. The first thing we told you is that you oftentimes do not have peer review. One, because as I told you at the top, if companies have leverage, they do not necessarily have to allow this peer review to happen. But second, because what companies do is they end up funding multiple different universities to draw the same conclusions or similar conclusions and then avoid any peer review or comparison point. And that is why you aren't unlikely to get peer review that meaningfully has an accountability mechanism on each other. But finally, if their argument is these are niche, unique areas of research, there's probably an insufficient amount of other research institutions investigating the same exact thing for there to be meaningful comparisons and accountability that are drawn. So all three mechanisms of accountability they've given you fall out of this debate. What does that mean? It means you allow companies to spread misinformation under the guise of credibility from ostensibly independent institutions. And that meant thousands of people end up dying or suffering from cancer as a result. They could not laugh off this argument. Second theme then on why the change in funding is marginal. If there's a PO, I'm happy to take it out.
You claim that corporations massively shift the priorities of all universities on your side in a bad way, but also that funding is marginal. How are those two things both true?
So 2 reasons. One, obviously it applies in your best case where it is excessive. But secondly, because that mechanism isn't dependent on funding. It's just about how companies pick up on individual professors and individual departments and shift their priorities based on self-interest. It's not about holistically on aggregate the amount of funding that happens. So why is the change in funding marginal? Decreasing all the benefits they get from their side. Because they say there are unique incentives to find like long-term speculative research that governments want. A couple of things to say. One, governments already have an incentive to fund universities to attract professors and national prestige. Governments have no in-house ability to do research, so they have to outsource to research institutions and universities. And by the way, even for long-term projects, and the reason why is those long-term projects also attract professors and also attract national prestige. For example, space exploration, which people do in fact find very interesting. Second, because usually the funding, as we told you, is just for a single study. As we told you at the top, companies have massive leverage because they could just turn to other universities, which is a reason why the funding doesn't trickle out to a vast majority of other areas of research, but just to fulfill the one niche that those companies are trying to serve. Thirdly, because we told you that funding doesn't end up trickling out for other purposes, because of the patent argument that we gave you on why they steal intellectual property rights and preclude universities from doing other research that might spill into the areas over which that company now has a patent. But fourthly, we told you there are massive other ways in which they can get funding, right? Partnerships with hospitals and partnerships with labs. What we opposed was corporate sponsorship. There are a wide array of other means by which they can get the very same funding. So the change in funding from opposition rather, even if it mattered, is probably awfully marginal in this debate and not an independent path to victory for their side. Third thing then on how they shift priorities of universities. I mean, we told you that there is a time trade-off, that this changes the way that grads are trained and the ways in which labs are developed. All they wanted to do is point out attention, which I already resolved. But what was the implication of this theme? Both sides agreed that universities have massive capacity to do socially valuable research. They want to attract government funding, so they have incentive to do so in the future, and they want to explore more and more areas for natural interest. That happens on our side of the house when individual professors and departments aren't beholden to the niches that companies force them to fill. What did that mean? It meant that you can have research universities that get involved in environmental technology that can save the planet from climate change. On their side, they make them beholden to a couple of companies with niche interests. On our side, we allow them to fulfill the social good. For all those reasons, very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that fine speech. And now I'd like to welcome the third opposition speaker. Here.
everyone? Fantastic. Just to reiterate, I would prefer POIs to be indicated visually, if that's okay. Great. Unfortunately for Team Canada, the word marginal was not sufficient to constitute analysis in this debate on the nature of academic research, because they never engaged with the way up that we gave you from the very beginning of Joe's speech. We were happy to accept that there are select instances in which, for a variety of reasons, some of which may be corporate sponsorship, some of which may be mere incompetence, some of which may be academics seeking a reputation, bad research exists. What we told you was that we were happy to accept that in exchange for having a wider breadth of research which can be checked against each other, a wider breadth of research which leads to the kind of key speculative discoveries we all value from universities. Because they never engaged with that, and because they never were willing to counterweigh, other than simply asserting the marginality of literally the majority of academic research that exists under the status quo, they lost this debate. I'm going to ask two questions in this speech. Firstly, what types of research get funded on either side of the house? And secondly, what is the impact of corporate accountability before finally engaging in a way up between the two teams? Let's look at this first question of what types of research get funded on either side of the house. Note that we told you from Joe's speech with very little response that there is significantly less research in discovery and speculation, and also that largely research is checked by mechanisms like peer review, like citation, like replication norms, which means that the vast majority of that research that is lost is good. What engagement did we receive from Team Canada? They firstly told us that governments fund research. Note how improbable this is when they failed to engage the reasons we gave you from Joe's speech, why when one study can cost literally millions of dollars, governments that also have to fund things like transport, education, hospitals, schools, a whole range of other stuff, are very unlikely to give it, particularly in instances where the yields of research, like speculative research, is likely to be low. New and third, they bring out a few responses here where they tell us that the national prestige of professors in space means that governments will dedicate huge amounts of money to this. A couple of things to note here. Note firstly that they tell us in the same speech that professors are largely considered so irrelevant by most people that they won't even read their names on the front of the study. A massive tension in the characterization of the importance of academic institutions. But also, when we tell you that the research we lose out on is things like cutting-edge samples, cutting-edge innovation on things like new synthetic alternatives to insulin, and so on, the fact that governments fund precisely the things like space, which are essentially just useless prestige projects, speaks to the level of incompetence that we get from government funding on our side of the house. When they tell us also, though, so insistently that governments will fill this gap in important research, what they are conceding, panel, and this is crucial, is that the large majority of research that is funded by corporations does have a value, is important. Then they tell us when people compete for this government funding, a higher quality of discovery research occurs on their side of the house. Note that this same mechanism, no thank you, applies in instances where people are competing for corporate funding, but also actually we think that things like competition create incentives firstly for bad research and research which overstates the results it's likely to get, but also huge amounts of risky, speculative, cutting-edge research in medicine necessarily loses out when it may well yield absolutely nothing. The vast majority of studies Team Canada can't cite because they have no results. Then, and they tell us in their third speech that this frame is crucial. They tell us that much of this research is verifying the safety of products, but because they do discovery in-house because they don't want to share material. A couple of things to note here. Firstly, there are lots of reasons why a corporation might fund discovery in a university. Those are largely to do with the fact that the most brilliant researchers, the best labs, and the most structurally good individuals work in those institutions, right? But they also assert in their second speech that these universities are largely buying up discovery-related intellectual property rights. They tried to resolve this in their third speech by telling us that they were engaging with our best-case scenario, but no panel that almost every response he gave rested entirely on the fact that this research would be used in that way. Pretty problematic for them to do this. Then they tell us, and notice they say this from the first speech, that this funding occurs in the context of trying to obtain specific results in most cases. Note that this is largely not true, right? We think there's a large amount of speculative funding that takes place from corporations precisely because they want to be in the position to get that newest drug, that newest innovation in AI. We think that was a pretty inadequate characterization. But also note how vague they were about how this actually happens. They tell us that these companies will massage sample sizes. This is actually incredibly difficult to do in order to achieve a particular result unless you are actively doing things like changing numbers on a spreadsheet or using a flawed methodology, something that is very likely to be picked up by the kind of mechanisms we talked about, but we pushed them on this. And then bizarrely in second, they were like, very little of this research will actually be falsified. It will just be interpreted subjectively. Note that the best case scenario for Team Canada is that they lose a vast amount of research in order to have a small amount of research which is somewhat slanted gone. That is a very disadvantageous comparative for their side. But also, all of the examples that they used up and down their bench are to do with falsified research that we think would largely be caught by our systems. Things like the deliberate omission of data, or bizarrely in third, literally lying about cancer research. Not something that any company selling cancer medication wants to do. Then they tell us academics are dependent on this research and can't call out bad research because there exists a lack of regulation. This was an assertion. We proved that there was a large amount of regulation. But let's talk a bit about the incentives of academics. Because these individuals are people who depend largely on reputation. When they tell us that these are people who want to be able to get to things like the rank of professor, that is something that explicitly comes from having a good reputation within your community. They tell us in third that people won't speak out because they lack knowledge of studies. Most academics can read. Probably they don't lack knowledge. They tell us that these people won't speak out or that people won't receive reputational damage because they can't see their name on the front of the study. They just see the word Harvard. Most academics can read. But also, when they read that name Harvard, they know that they can amass a huge amount of positive press within their own academic community by debunking that extremely prestigious study. That's something that brings attention, resources, funding, and focus to their own institution. Let's look then at the very little engagement that we got from their side. Liberty's already told you why the various tensions they pointed out in our case were problematic, but I'm going to look specifically at this idea of it being easy for companies to get around peer review. They told us two things on this. Firstly, that Angela's many examples proved that companies could easily get around peer review. Something you may have noticed about Angela's examples panel is that they're largely concentrated in the latter half of the 20th century. The reason for that is because the kind of peer review regulations we described evolved precisely in response to corporate capture of academic institutions and bodies. That's because there are actually very robust regulations in place in the wake of things like the Johnson & Johnson scandal or scandals with tobacco companies to protect against that. Then they tell us corporations can fund research in multiple universities to fake replication. Look, I'm going to go out on a limb here and say some people who do peer reviewing are quite clever and can probably tell when the same individual has funded multiple researches that are being used to replicate each other, probably not going to get through most decent peer review. Let's look then at this final claim that they trot out at the end of their second speech, giving it, frankly, the 15 seconds of analysis that it deserves. They tell us that companies own the intellectual property of these studies. Note the contradiction with their claim that these are not studies that bring about new discoveries. But also, note that this is not exclusive to their side in any way, because companies are likely to buy research from universities, whether or not they funded that research in the first instances. But also, when they characterize that universities lose money because patents go to companies, it is genuinely hard for me to understand how, why any university would pursue something that actively results in it losing money. Look, universities trade on reputation. They trade on their ability to exist in academic circles. When bad research takes that away, that is something that is a loss that can never be repaired by any amount of chaos. Incredibly proud to stand for good research.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that speech, as that concludes the constructive part of this debate. And without further ado, I'd like to welcome the opposition reply to close the debate from their side of the House. Here.
Can everyone hear me okay? We've got quite a confused world from side proposition. A world where corporations pump huge amounts of money into university, but also the government could magically make it up. A world where in their second speech, they tell you that the corporations benefit from having property rights, but also tell you that they have no incentive to innovate. A world where they tell you that corporations benefit from the independent stamp of approval of these institutions, but also that these institutions are entirely dependent. We were very clear from my speech to the end of our case. Bad research exists. We conceded that. What they needed to show you is why bad research outweighed the critical research only corporations fund, which only occurs under our side. They never did that. They can never win this debate. 2 questions for you in reply. Firstly, what sort of research do corporations fund? Secondly, weighing that comes out. What sort of research do corporations fund? We told you about the critical research done by corporations, where the risk attached, where the large amounts of data required means that only corporations are in a position to do this. What response do we hear? We hear about government funding, which in their first speech is going to make up all of this funding, and in their second speech they concede won't make all of this up. We were clear, this is billions of dollars. This is billions that they are not spending on research, billions of dollars of research they are losing out on. And they told you they have no interest in innovating new areas, they just want to verify existing areas. We told you that that was absolutely ridiculous, that they want to innovate new things. They want to use the academics from these universities to make new discoveries, to benefit their business because of the property rights they talked about. We tell you it is better that the drug exists than that it doesn't exist under their side. But also, they never showed you why verification was necessarily bad. You were clear, it's probably quite good to have independent university verification to make sure products are safe. So what they challenge then is the checks and balances of this. We told you very clearly, academics care. They could have top jobs. They could be making hundreds of thousands a year, that they are slaving away in labs because they care about their reputation, they care about their field. But we took them at their best. We said even if they have an economic interest purely, then at that point, they would want to rip apart faulty research to seem independent, to get the next job from that corporation. Even in their best faulty view of academics, we showed why we have robust checks on falsified research. So, given that, let's weigh these things up. They tell us about 2 bad things. They tell us about falsification, and they tell us about shifting interest. As they conceded in a POI in their second, we think blatantly falsified information is on the extremes. And their extreme of Johnson & Johnson, we showed if it is falsified, it gets destroyed, you are held accountable, we have checks. But we told you very clearly, your reputation is critical. If you destroy your reputation, you are never going to get any grants in the future. And if you need grants in the future, you need to maintain your reputation. For the very economic incentives they talked about, there is the utmost priority to make sure you are not falsifying things. And then they talked about shifting interests. We never contested that. We conceded there is some bad research. But what did they never engage with? They never engage with the critical drug research we get on our side that doesn't fit into election cycles, but might mean a better form of insulin in 10 years' time. A new form of immunotherapy that only a corporation can fund because you need to test it on a wide group of people who are hard to reach. They never engage with those crucial good things they bring. They never engage with AI. They never engage with corporations in investing in research into the ethics of that AI. We told you about all of this critical research we get under our side, and we are very proud to stand for the importance of that research on side opposition.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome the proposition reply to close the debate out from their side, and indeed the debate as a whole. Hear, hear.
Can everyone hear me? At the end of this debate, side opposition's strategy is very interesting. They drop all claims and stand on one limb, the straw man of our case of bad research, and that even if bad research exists on either side, that their side has good research that outweighs the bad. But from the beginning, our strategy from proposition was clear, that good research for cancer products, for research of all those immensely socially valuable products would exist on either way. That academic research is geared towards verification, not creation. That the company still wants profit from those immensely beneficial breakthrough products, and that is happening in-house. That governments have a reason to fund cancer products as well. But the clear reason why we could not stand for the policy of opposition today was that we did not want that additional funding if it went into bad studies. We could not sell our academic integrity to the highest bidder. For those reasons, I'm very proud to propose. 2 main themes in this speech then. First of all, does the additional funding lead to good research? And second of all, does it have an opportunity cost? First, on whether the additional funding leads to good research. Because we can see, yes, opposition will have more funding on their side of the house. But we told you we didn't care about that additional funding if it went to overwhelmingly poorer research. Why did we explain that? First of all, that good research would happen on either side of the house. That the examples they wanted to use, like insulin and crucial health products, are not being created at these university labs, but within the company because they are proprietary products. That they don't want these products outside of the walls of the company, and that there are immensely good reasons to do so on either way, that there's great profit to be made, that the government has great reasons to fund it as well, and that the money they would be funding into it doesn't take away from funding buses, but rather improving healthcare systems that every government also has incentives to improve national competition, university rankings. That's why all their examples of Google with self-driving cars and pharmaceutical companies' research all happen within the company itself, and we would not lose on our side. But the additional research they create on their side was problematic research. And don't let opposition's straw man of our arguments let you get away with the fact that these are not patently false studies with ridiculously small sample sizes that are easy to call out, but subtle misleading examples where how you set up the study, whether even if the study is completely sound, the way you interpret the results with immensely large data sets and how you come about those conclusions. The only mechanisms that opposition wanted to constrain this ability to have problematic studies is peer review and reputation. But we told you that that peer review is extremely limited if companies are capturing peer review boards themselves, that the entire industry of the tobacco industry, that every conglomerate that uses talc powder with billions of dollars of funding is able to capture the market and flood field studies with of how they're safe and suffocate any studies that contradict. That even if somehow someone individually is able to point out that there are problems, that such dependence on corporation funding and the threat of pulling that funding means it is immensely difficult for any individual to speak up. But finally, they also ignored the nuance we had all the way from first proposition, was that even if internally within the academic sphere there is recognition that these studies are not entirely sound, the public themselves does not have the knowledge or technical expertise to ever be able to sift through that. Notice how most individuals read their news from the media, and the way the media captures it is not incredibly nuanced in the way that individual data points were eliminated in problematic ways. That nuance was never going to be able to be understood, and that's why you led to the examples of talc and all of the millions and thousands of women that gained cancer as a result. The reputation harms accrue too late when the harm is already done to consumers, and in many cases, the enormous profit that companies can make in the meantime is worth the trade-off for them. That was a risk we could not swallow on side proposition, that risk to consumers would happen too late, and we could not accept problematic research from the billions of dollars in these mass industries profiting off of that. The second theme in the debate then was about the opportunity cost. We told you why this kind of research funding displaces more valuable research at the point when the universities shift towards verification rather than creation. And even in the cases where they do focus on discovery, that those benefits go to companies and not universities themselves. At the end of this debate, there's one thing you need to remember from side proposition. The additional funding is not one we want if it goes to bad studies. We cannot accept that on side proposition, and I'm incredibly proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for that speech, and indeed everyone for the debate as a whole. First of all, congratulations on making it all the way through the prelim rounds of online WSDC. I will now request for us to be moved, and we'll be back in considering technical times as well in somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, hoping for as short as possible. All right? Thank you all.
Thank you to Team England for a great debate.
Thanks so much, guys.
That was amazing.
Team England, do you mind taking a photo with us if possible?
We would love to.
Could we wait for our other two teammates to come
Yeah,
around the
we've got
corner?
2 people coming, and also if you could send it to one of us, that would be great.
Yeah, no worries, sounds good.
We'll just cross them in.
Great.
You can do while our other 2 are just coming. Sorry.
No problem at all.
We've just been told that, so we're supposed to be social distance.
We will social distances in the photo.
Okay, sounds good.